Now, this lecture, I've got to confess, is going to go off on a tangent. But I think that's okay, in fact, necessary, because the tangent is the term megalithic, what it means, and how it can be applied to this southern British culture, the Windmill Hill culture, the first and probably the most influential of all the Neolithic cultures in Great Britain and possibly in the British Isles as well. We know that its two greatest monuments are Avebury and Stonehenge, and we know that these are always described, and fittingly so, as megalithic monuments. So what does the term megalithic mean? Within what kind of a context of megalithic art should these two great monuments be set? How can we understand them? Lots of cultures throughout the world have adopted a megalithic style of art and architecture. Easter Island is a prime example. In Western Europe, many Neolithic and later Bronze Age cultures adopted megalithic styles. Spain was the scene of a blended megalithic culture with interesting parallels in Central Europe and eventually the British Isles. Southeastern France is the area of the densest early megalithic tomb construction. Megalithic monuments of every type, discussed in this lecture, line the Atlantic coast of France. Carnac in Brittany is the site of a monumental complex as great and as complicated as Avebury, in many ways more complicated. The British Isles, in general, are great megalithic sites, and they stretch all the way to Scandinavia. Denmark and southern Sweden are great centers of megalithic art. In these coastal lands, the great stones which gave this widespread style its name were almost certainly used in the development of Neolithic navigation and astronomy. A millennium and a half or so after it got going, in other words, in the 29th or 28th century BCE, the Windmill Hill culture began to use megalithic construction in its cult buildings. Now, megaliths are large stones, from the Greek megas, which means big, and lithos, which means stone. Large stones either standing alone or used as part of a construction involving mostly other large stones. There's some typical megalithic constructions, some terms we must get used to: menhir, cromlech, and dolmen. All three of these words come from the Breton language. Menhirs are large stones placed upright in the ground, from the Breton words for tall, here, and stone, man. Cromlechs are circles of menhirs, from the Breton word for a necklace. And dolmens are tombs consisting of several upright stones over which large flat stones are laid, from the Breton word for table. Okay. Megalithic construction has been taken up by many cultures throughout the world at various moments in their development and then abandoned. How does this happen? Well, the assumption is that that big stone style is observed by members of a culture which had not used it before, and is then imported and imitated more or less exactly and adapted more or less freely. The culture in question may well abandon the megalithic style at some point, and here again, the large stone heads of Easter Island are a splendid example of this kind of tendency. Now, several cultures in Europe, several cultures of Neolithic and Bronze Age Europe, took up megalithic construction in the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE. In Spain, a new culture was formed by the fusion of such sedentary, probably matriarchal farming peoples as those of the Cueva de los Murciélagos, a fusion of them with pastoral conquerors, cattle-driving nomads who came in from the north. And this fused culture took to erecting large stones as burial monuments and as freestanding sculptures, apparently depicting a goddess with big eyes. I suppose she watched you. This culture also produced a distinctive style of pottery known as bell beakers. Bell beakers, which are very much, they call that because they're very much the shape of a standard church bell. In the late 3rd millennium BCE, megalithic bell beaker cultures spread northwards. The burial sites, which are mostly dolmens, are, if we look at a map, especially dense along the Atlantic coast, what is today Portugal and northwestern Spain, and it continues along the Atlantic coast of Spain, and then this line of density continues through the Pyrenees. Down in the southeastern part of Spain, there are some extraordinarily magnificent tombs, which are called tholoi, from a Greek word, and they are rounded tombs with a chambered tomb within them, and the chambered tomb is capped by remarkable corbelling, not arching yet, but corbelling. These are very reminiscent of the tombs of Mycenae, of Bronze Age Greece, and the assumption of Child and others was that these great tombs developed in Greece, somewhat possibly influenced by Egyptian models, were then imitated consciously further west in the Mediterranean. Once again, carbon-14 dating has turned that all around, and we know that the tombs at Los Millares in the southeast of Spain are several centuries older than the tombs in Mycenae. So either they were imitated by Eastern Mediterraneans, or these are really spontaneous and separate kind of developments. Central Europe was also the home of megalithic bell beaker cultures, and a fierce dispute currently rages about any possible connections between the Central European and the Spanish megalithic bell beaker cultures. So Europe is beginning to get covered, you see, with variations of the same kind of thing. You would think that the connection between a certain kind of pot from which one drank beer and large stones of ever-watchful goddesses or burial markers would have little, if anything, to do with each other, but they did. Why exactly is a question which awaits its own exploration. The densest and probably the earliest zone of megalithic construction, mostly as tomb monuments, once again, is southeastern France. From the coastline of the Mediterranean, west from that wonderful Riviera where Nîmes and Agde and Béziers and Narbonne and so on sit, up into the Piedmont of the Cevennes. You can call them mountains if you want. They're really extended hills, it seems to me. One of those departments, the department of the Aveyron, has over 500 such tombs. Another strictly local feature of these tombs is a carving, usually on one or maybe two of the megaliths of each tomb, of a figure with two eyes and two breasts, holding in presumably her arms, an elongated object which can be understood as a wheat sheaf, an axe, or something like a hockey stick. You are free to do what you wish with this kind of interpretation. Some of the most interestingly varied uses of megalithic construction occurred along the coastlines of Atlantic Europe. Not just burial dolmens, but also lots of cromlechs and lots of avenues, straightened out cromlechs if you want, and just simply upright menhirs, avenues of menhirs, with a purpose that has been argued very seriously is astronomical and for navigational goals. Brittany, the peninsula of Brittany, is unusually rich in megalithic monuments of several kinds, apparently erected as early as the 6th millennium BCE, the 6th millennium, the 5000s. That's astonishing. They get going. Many of these monuments of Brittany may be older than anything down in the southeast of France, in the Aveyron, for example. But that's much disputed for reasons I really won't go into now. Archaeologists working on these Breton sites began the adaptive native interpretation of the spread of Neolithic culture westward, which Alistair Whittle has been the great champion of most recently. Local originality often seems the only way to explain the precocious developments of this area. Breton megalithic styles clearly influenced the Windmill Hill culture and other Neolithic cultures in the British Isles. There was an interesting article in an English newspaper a few years ago saying, "The French built Stonehenge," which is the sort of thing with outraged standard public current English sensibility, meaning simply that Breton megalithic styles obviously had a massive influence upon the great late megalithic monument of Stonehenge. Carnac, on the Bay of Quiberon, on the south coast of Brittany, is the site of a monumental complex at least comparable to Avebury, and in several features it shows far greater scientific sophistication. The dolmens of the area, which are scattered around the Bay of the Quiberon Peninsula, reaches out, cutting off a bit of the Atlantic right there, a very shallow part of the Atlantic, which is called the Bay of Quiberon. In the part of the Bay of Quiberon right up against the beach, known as Carnac Plage, a favorite summer resort place for tired Parisians and other French urbanites, lies the evidence of what must have been a very important maritime city. Carnac has been claimed by some of its enthusiasts as the longest inhabited site in Western Europe, because although what's there now is sort of a spa, kind of a tourist place, a few fishing boats, nothing terribly important, it looks as though habitation has been continuous, and that in the period we're talking about, the megalithic period, the coastline extended considerably further south into this very shallow bay. Unfortunately, the waters of the bay now cover what was probably the settlement area or the warehousing area of this remarkably early great port. The oldest of the dolmens, these dolmens serve the same kind of function as the long barrows of southern Britain. And the long barrows of southern Britain in the earlier phases of the Windmill Hill culture were much simpler constructions than dolmens, mostly of earth. Eventually they became megalithic in having revetments around the side and some big megaliths in the front, in the eastern end of the West Kennett Long Barrow and of Wayland Smithy. But first of all, they were wooden structures. Not here. These dolmens are stone. Usually a dolmen has not just its own table construction with bodies within it, but there's a little bit of an avenue, a little bit of a corridor leaning into it, which is necessary because the dolmen is covered by a large mound. You're often a quite perfectly circular mound, rising not terribly high, but enough to cover it. Sometimes the earth has been taken away from these dolmens, and we see simply the stones standing up. The bones within are gone. The stones are still there. The surrounding earth has gone. But it hasn't gone from Kerkado. If you want to take a look at a map of the Karnak area, one sees rising up just sort of north of the central area of Karnak Plage, probably fairly due north of the original city, which I at least attribute to the waters in which one goes bathing these days. The oldest of them, Kerkado, appears, according to carefully calibrated carbon-14 dating, to have been used first in 5840 BCE. Now, you've got a right or wrong factor of 300 years there. It might have been as early as 5340, but it might have been as late as 5340, but it might have been earlier than 5840. That's astonishing. To have this kind of construction before much of anything in the way of Neolithic agriculture can have been present in the region. On the island of Gavrinis, to the east of this complex, just to the east of the Bay of Quiberon, is a little inland sea called the Morbihan, which in Breton means the Little Sea. And in this Little Sea, where in fact Julius Caesar fought a very important naval engagement against the great naval power of the people of Karnak, on the island of Gavrinis, in the Bay of Morbihan, just to the east of the Bay of Quiberon, is one of the largest and probably the most richly sculptured chambered tombs in Europe. Many of the stones along the avenue leading into the central chambered tomb have got magnificent carving in them, a relief carving. Not simply one stone with this goddess holding her hockey stick or whatever it is, of the sort you find down in the southeast, but endlessly complicated designs which have been interpreted as representing sails or serpents or axes, or there's one peculiarly interesting implement there which has been interpreted as a hatchet or as a peace pipe to smoke something, some kind of interesting herb. Freudian interpretation has seen it as phallic, of course, almost anything would be, but that's a pretty good candidate. It looks to me more like a water pistol than anything else, although it clearly can't have been that. But that's there along with what are thought to be sails and axes and serpents, and clearly some very complicated artistic statement is being made, which has so far, of course, resisted decoding. The most amazing feature of Karnak's megalithic complex, though, is neither the extraordinary early age of the Kerkado dolmen or the extraordinarily sophisticated aesthetic presentation of the Gavrinis dolmen, which is a special kind of dolmen extended out into what was called a chambered tomb. What it is are the alignments of menhirs, which stretch over a mile from a cromlech of huge stones to the southwest, off to the northeast. And there's sort of three sections to this great alignment of stones, and there's another kind of cromlech in the whole process. These alignments were laid out to the north of what I'm convinced must have been this important seaport. They are oriented roughly, sort of, towards the midsummer sunrise position. Professor Alexander Thom, professor of engineering at Oxford University, and as you know, professorships are extremely rare in English universities. Many people whom we would call professors there are called readers or lecturers. Actually, to hold a professorial chair is something. Thom, a very serious engineer, in other words, spent many, many years interpreting these megalithic monuments. And he, working with various astronomers, is convinced that the menhirs are aligned really not so much to mark the place where roughly the sun will rise on Midsummer's Day, but they have to do with lunar calculations, which means that they aren't straight lines, they're kind of curved. Apparently over 10,000 great stones were set up in these parallel rows, 11 parallel rows. At one point that it narrows down to 5 or 6 and it expands again. Most of them are gone, of course. I think something like 3,000 are still upright. They've been used as the stones of Avery were used. And it's very mystifying to see this extraordinary thing. They don't seem to have any burial purpose either. There are dolmens attached along this alignment, but they're not sort of part of the alignment itself. And the astronomical putative purpose is so questionable as to be wide open, so one doesn't really know what they were for. I wonder if perhaps the captain of a vessel who had made a successful trading trip down to Spain, or possibly even further, carrying tin from Cornwall around to some place where Mediterranean ships could pick up his tin for the great bronze industry that is thriving in the eastern Mediterranean. We know that this kind of trading was going on around there. If such a captain returning from a particularly successful venture might not decide to have a stone set up to endow a stone in this alignment, or whatever its purposes might have been. That's, I suppose, an irresponsible and wildly amateur guess, postulation, but on the other hand, everybody has contributed such wonderful ideas that it's perfectly all right. There is some connection with midsummer, at least as far as Breton folklore is concerned. The Bretons are a very interesting and stubborn people who maintain their difficult language, their difficult form of the Celtic language, and who maintain remarkable numbers of old traditions. For example, those who think that these menhirs are involved with fertility find Breton folklore, not just Breton folklore, tremendously encouraging. We know from the reports to the bishop of parish priests of the 19th century, Brittany has also been a place producing many, many of the priests of France, a very devoutly pious kind of area, that priests would regularly preach sermons against women of the community going out either at full moons or at midsummer and rubbing themselves without benefit of clothing against these menhirs in order to conceive. Bretons are unhappy if, in 19th century Bretons were unhappy if their families had less than 10 children, and conception was an important point. Well, you don't have to be terribly Freudian, to see the kind of connection right here, which is picked up by people who interpret Avery. People like Keeler, for example, who's sure that those stones had a kind of phallic purpose, which we'll be talking about later. So, we also know from Breton folklore that on Midsummer's Day, all of the 10,000 stones of Carnac, even those that are no longer there, will race down to the plage and go for a swim. And while they are gone, if you're careful, you will look into the socket holes where they're set up, and you will see a golden treasure. And you can take some of it, but don't be greedy, because they come back in extraordinarily nanosecond speed and crush the greedy within these tombs, which helps explain a few of the skeletons that have been found. Well, what to do with this, I don't know. It's obviously very complicated. We have no less than an Oxford professor of engineering discovering remarkable astronomical purposes for these things. We have Freudian purposes. We have all of these other stories. Perhaps if the Freudian purpose is correct, then there is no fertility monument in the world, not even those extraordinary erotic temples of India, which is comparable to Karnak. This is a great riddle that begs to be solved. And many fine minds have put their best energies in trying to solve this riddle without any at all satisfactory solutions so far. Unfortunately, as Aubrey Burrell himself has remarked, as the great R.J.C. Atkinson, the main excavator of Stonehenge, remarked years ago, we will never know exactly what the purpose of these structures was, because they were not written down. Such is the importance of writing. Well, even more interesting than the alignments, it seems to me, are several of the extraordinarily tall menhirs. The tallest menhir of all is the thing called on most maps Le Grand Menhir, which is French. Bretons insist it should be called Ergrach, which is the proper Breton way to say the same thing. Ergrach was 60 feet tall, a little bit over 60 feet. Nowhere in the world is there except of course, unless you want to consider Egyptian obelisks of a later period, as menhirs. No, except for them, there is nothing like it anywhere in the world. What on earth was it for? And those of you who have a chance to look at a map in any of the standard guidebooks will notice that the Grand Menhir has been connected with other lesser menhirs, any other menhir is lesser, by Tom in a very interesting kind of pattern. He's convinced that it was the center of what is frankly a lunar observatory, which was able to predict a number of lunar movements. The maximum midwinter moonset, the minimum midwinter moonset, and so on, could be tracked out. There are 6 lines of connection lining up a menhir on one side, a dolmen on another side, the line of sight passing right through the great menhir, or then 2 menhirs or 2 dolmens or whatever. I don't know how many of us are familiar with the terms maximum and minimum moonsets, midwinter, midsummer, whatever. I think we're all aware that, especially in those northern latitudes, the moon rises and sets and moves around at different altitudes above the horizon of the Earth, unlike the sun. So when the moon is at its highest, then you want to see where it rises and where it sets. When it's at its lowest, and up in the islands of the Orkneys, for example, to the north of Scotland, the moon appears sometimes never really to set, but simply to move along the horizon, the flat horizon of the ocean. So the moon is much more variable than the sun, and much more difficult to figure out. And there are cycles between maximum and minimum moonrise and moonset, especially if you're calculating them by midsummer and midwinter, cycles of precisely 18.61 years. Now, Tom went to work measuring endlessly the distance between these megaliths, and even before there were computers, he put all of his measurements together, he crunched them together, and he came up with a unit called the megalithic yard, which he decided was the unit of measurement used in Brittany, in the British Isles, even in some of the dolmens and menhirs of Scandinavia. And then he also was able to align these astronomical calculations with much of the other data which his inexhaustible team collected. Another value of the great menhir was clearly navigational. If you were hoving into the Bay of Quiberon, whatever they called it in those days, it was very valuable to be able to see that you're on the line between several of those great menhirs out of the south of the Quiberon Peninsula and the great menhir. You would know exactly where you were. In fact, the navigational value of the great menhir was remarked by a French ship commander, member of the French Navy, as recently as 1659 CE. Another local reported that in the year 1727 he had seen this great menhir fallen, and it is today fallen. It broke into 3 drastic pieces. And everyone is convinced, practically everyone is convinced, that was just, I don't know, either a movement of, it was obviously a lightning rod. It was tremendously vulnerable to lightning at that elevation. It could have been some kind of an earthquake, who knows. However, a new theory proposed by the brilliant professor of such things at the University of Rennes in Brittany, Rennes, as they say in Britain, is convinced that this is one of several broken menhirs which were designed to be broken. That whatever tall menhir the French sea captain was talking about in 1659 was one of several others which this professor is convinced would have served better navigational purposes. His name is L'Elguach, a wonderful Breton name again, and he's written a brilliant book, Les Menhirs Brisés, Les Dieux qu'on brise, about the gods which one breaks, that these menhirs represent gods who are offered up in broken portions, or perhaps are broken in order to keep control of them, or anyway. But this is a work of immense erudition, as well as a very interesting, very, very surgically precise theory. So, I hope this gives you some idea of what menhirs and other dolmens can do. What megalithic construction, difficult as it was in that simple time to set up. Any of the stones set up anywhere in the British Isles like this were very difficult to raise, to socket, and to put in any kind of a straight alignment. Extraordinary challenge indeed. They all pale beside the extraordinary Karnak complex. Karnak, Avebury, Stonehenge, monuments of remarkable complexity, which challenged the imagination of modern heirs of that culture to figure out what the forebears were up to when they spent so much time and so much energy doing these things. Well, the Irish Sea is a great center of megalithic construction. On the eastern side, on the side of Great Britain, there's so many of them. Let me just mention Long Meg and her daughters, Castle Rig and Callanish, extraordinary ones. Long Meg and her daughters is in Cumberland, that northwestmost county of England. Is Castle Rig. Long Meg and her daughters is a huge flattened circle, very clumsily made. People obviously didn't have much sense of a circle, although some have tried to give astronomical significance to these flattened circles as well. Its diameter is 111 yards at its widest and 94 at its narrowest. Aubrey Burrell, interpreting it, guesses that it was the ritual center of a Neolithic community of maybe 250 to 400 people. He's a master of demographic figures, and I think figures like that of his ought to be taken with much respect. He surmises that it was set up for fertility dances rather than any astronomical calculation. That was the function of this megalithic monument. He decides a lot of this on the basis of analogy. He's very interested in the fertility dances of American Plains Indians, for example, and he sees a connection, imagining that the ancient British were doing very much the same kind of thing. Castle Rig, also in Cumberland, is one of the best preserved of these great stone circles. These are cromlechs, in other words. And it's got in the middle of it a rectangular stone structure, not the middle, but at an interesting place in it, a rectangular stone enclosure which has received much speculation. Even Burrell, who's very skeptical of astronomical purposes for these megalithic monuments, points out the largest menhir in the circle, some 7 feet tall, seems to be aligned with the point on the horizon at which the sun rises, not at midsummer or midwinter, but at the equinoxes of fall and spring. If Burrell will admit so much, it's something to think about, I think. Scotland is quite rich in such sites, especially on outer islands such as the Hebrides and the Orkneys. Callanish, on the island of Lewis, is quite remarkable. Lewis is in the outer Hebrides. It is a dolmen set within a cromlech, which is linked to 4 avenues of parallel menhirs. We've got all 3 of these basic megalithic types: dolmen, cromlech, and menhir. And the orientation of the avenues has been explained by Tom as, again, a lunar observatory, which also pointed to the point on the horizon where a key navigational star arose at 2700 BCE. Now, of course, these navigational stars, points of rising and so on, have changed a little bit. And Tom is one of those who uses these star charts to date the construction of these extraordinary monuments, operating, of course, on the hypothesis that they have to point to something. What can you see that they point to? Well, they point to the point at which star X came above the horizon at a certain date, and so that must be the date of the whole monument. Obviously, these are hypothetical structures, but then so is most of science. Nothing different about that. Now, Ireland has many megalithic monuments, large and small. The hinges of Ireland are sometimes thought to be a sign of British Neolithic influence. British Neolithic culture exercising its influence across the Irish Sea. They cluster, as is true of France, in the southwest and the northeast. The southwest, the old kingdom of Munster in Iron Age Celtic terminology and throughout the Middle Ages. The northeast, the kingdom of Ulster, is beset, as we know it has been through all of its history, by cultural and military brilliance and nastiness. These are the 2 areas where megalithic circles, where megalithic constructions are particularly powerful. Circles, lines, dolmens, menhirs, the works. They're also the 2 areas of historic Ireland in which, until modern times, Irish political power, economic activity, and so on concentrated. Now, Dublin is not in either Ulster or Munster. But until the importance of Dublin, a foreign city founded by Vikings, taken over by the English, the center of the English Pale, until that foreign influence came in, it was Ulster and Munster, Tara and Cashel, which were the centers of Irish creativity, thought, economic, poetic, all the rest of it. That they should be particularly dense in megalithic monuments is no accident. Now, very few of the Irish stone circles or henges have the kind of dimensions of the greatest English or Scottish megalithic monuments, but archaeologists have recently found in Ireland the earliest known stone enclosure in Europe, which seems to date from the Mesolithic era, pre-Neolithic. Astonishing. Which might lead one to think that, well, this idea must have arisen in Ireland, spread elsewhere, and come back. That is, if you're a diffusionist. If you think ideas like this, inspiring human constructions, have to start somewhere and be diffused outward and so on. But if you're not a diffusionist, if you think that people in different places can have comparable ideas responding to comparable circumstances, then it makes a lot less mystery. And of course, the very greatest of the chambered tombs, very good in design, but extraordinary in size, in shape, in conception, in astronomical precision, is the great tomb of Newgrange, which is located with some other such great chambered tombs at the bend of the River Boyne, very close to the site of Tara, which was the sacred ritual seat of the High Kings of Ireland. It has recently been restored, but no one had to restore the extraordinary slit in the western end, through which, in the eastern end rather, through which the midwinter sun rose. The sun at midwinter rises, and for about 20 minutes, the light through this slit is cast upon an extraordinarily compelling piece of relief on one of the great stones. This is obviously not accidental, and it shows a kind of astronomical precision that is most impressive indeed. What about England? Well, I've mentioned northern England already, Cumberland. The whole point of this tangent was to give us a kind of frame, a kind of a context for the great megalithic monuments of the south of England, put up during the Windmill Hill culture and its offspring, the Wessex culture. Avery, of course, is the most massive megalithic monument in Britain, in the British Isles. Stonehenge is by far the most sophisticated. But we should remember that even earlier than those two great henges of the Windmill Hill culture, the long barrow of Wayland's smithy, built for the first time around 3700 BCE, was redesigned and greatly expanded about 3400 BCE by a revetment of local sorcel stones, stones, and also by a burial chamber, which is faced with stone, which makes it one of the earliest megalithic monuments of the Windmill Hill culture, a true predecessor to the astonishing things that would be done at Avebury and later on at Stonehenge.